On April 24, 1995, Gilbert Murray, president of the California Forestry Association, arrived at his Sacramento office to find a package waiting on his desk. The brown paper wrapping bore no return address, and the careful block lettering seemed almost childlike in its precision. Murray had no way of knowing that this innocuous-looking parcel would be his last earthly encounter, or that it represented the culmination of an 18-year reign of terror that had baffled the FBI and terrorized a nation. When the package exploded in Murray's hands, it marked the end of one chapter in one of America's most perplexing criminal cases, but the beginning of another. For the man who had crafted that bomb with meticulous care was not a typical terrorist driven by political fanaticism or religious extremism. He was a former mathematics professor with an IQ of 167, a Harvard graduate who had once been considered one of the brightest minds of his generation. His name was Theodore John Kaczynski, but the world would come to know him by another name entirely, the Unabomber. Theodore John Kaczynski was born on May 22, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, to Theodore Richard Kaczynski and Wanda Dombeck Kaczynski. From the very beginning, young Ted displayed the kind of intellectual precocity that both delighted and concerned his parents. His Polish-American father worked as a sausage maker, while his mother stayed home to nurture what she quickly recognized as an extraordinary mind. The Kaczynski household was one where learning was prized above all else. Ted's parents, particularly his mother Wanda, were determined to cultivate their son's obvious gifts. By age 5, Ted was reading at a high school level. By 10, he was solving complex mathematical problems that stumped many adults. His younger brother David, born in 1949, would later describe their childhood home as intellectually stimulating but emotionally cold, a place where academic achievement was the primary currency of parental approval. Ted's exceptional intelligence, however, came with a price. He struggled to connect with children his own age, finding their interests juvenile and their intellectual capacity frustrating. This social isolation would become a defining characteristic of his personality, one that would follow him throughout his life like a shadow he could never escape. In school, Ted's teachers marveled at his mathematical abilities. He could grasp concepts that typically required years of study, often intuiting solutions to problems before his instructors had finished explaining them. But his social awkwardness became increasingly apparent. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, preferred books to people, and seemed to exist in a world of abstract thought that few could enter. The Kaczynski family recognized that their son needed intellectual challenges beyond what his local school could provide. After much deliberation, they made a decision that would prove pivotal in shaping Ted's future. They allowed him to skip 2 grades. At age 15, 2 years younger than his classmates, Ted graduated from Evergreen Park Community High School as valedictorian. In 1958, 16-year-old Ted Kaczynski arrived at Harvard University, one of the youngest students ever admitted to the prestigious institution. If his parents hoped that Harvard would provide the intellectual stimulation their son craved while helping him develop social skills, they would be sorely disappointed. Harvard in the late 1950s was a bastion of East Coast privilege, populated by young men from wealthy families who had attended elite preparatory schools. Ted, the son of a Chicago sausage maker, was both intellectually superior to most of his classmates and culturally alien to their world. His dorm mates would later remember him as a ghostly figure who rarely spoke, spent most of his time alone in his room, and seemed to regard social interaction as an unnecessary distraction from his studies. But Ted's Harvard experience would be marked by more than mere social isolation. During his sophomore year, he volunteered to participate in what he believed were psychological experiments designed to test personality and intelligence. What he didn't know was that these experiments, conducted by Dr. Henry Murray, were part of a controversial study that some researchers now believe may have been connected to the CIA's MKUltra program. The experiments subjected Ted to intense psychological stress. He was required to write essays about his personal beliefs and life philosophy, then was subjected to aggressive interrogation designed to attack and ridicule everything he had written. The sessions were filmed, and Ted was forced to watch recordings of his own humiliation repeatedly. The stated purpose was to study how people respond to extreme stress and psychological attack. For a young man already struggling with social connections and emotional intimacy, these experiments may have been particularly damaging. Some researchers have speculated that this psychological trauma contributed to Ted's later development of paranoid and antisocial tendencies, though the extent of its influence remains a matter of debate. Despite the emotional turmoil, Ted excelled academically. He majored in mathematics and graduated in 1962 with a bachelor's degree, having maintained nearly perfect grades throughout his time at Harvard. His professors recognized his exceptional talent and encouraged him to pursue graduate studies. Ted decided to continue his education at the University of Michigan, where he would work toward a Ph.D. in mathematics. At the University of Michigan, Ted Kaczynski's mathematical genius truly flourished. He specialized in geometric function theory, a highly abstract field that even most mathematicians find difficult to comprehend. His doctoral dissertation, titled Boundary Functions, was so sophisticated that only a handful of experts in the field could fully understand its implications. Ted completed his Ph.D. in just 3 years, a remarkable achievement in a field where doctoral programs typically require 5 to 7 years of intensive study. His dissertation was widely praised by the mathematical community, with some experts predicting that he would make groundbreaking contributions to the field. At age 25, Ted Kaczynski seemed destined for a brilliant academic career. But even as Ted achieved professional success, his personal life remained a void. He had virtually no friends, no romantic relationships, and seemed incapable of forming meaningful connections with other people. His fellow graduate students found him brilliant but strange, noting his tendency to stare blankly during conversations and his apparent inability to engage in small talk or casual social interaction. Ted's growing misanthropy was becoming more apparent to those around him. He expressed contempt for what he saw as the shallow materialism of modern society and seemed particularly disdainful of technology and industrialization. These weren't merely academic or philosophical positions for Ted, they appeared to be deeply personal convictions that were shaping his worldview in fundamental ways. In 1967, upon completing his doctorate, Ted was offered a position as an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley. It was an extraordinary opportunity for someone so young, a chance to work at one of the world's most prestigious mathematics departments. Ted accepted the position and moved to California, apparently ready to begin what everyone expected would be a distinguished academic career. At Berkeley, Ted Kaczynski was assigned to teach undergraduate mathematics courses while conducting his own research. By all accounts, he was a competent but uninspiring teacher. Students found his lectures technically accurate but emotionally flat. He seemed to regard teaching as a necessary evil rather than an opportunity to share his passion for mathematics. Ted's research continued to impress his colleagues, but his social isolation deepened. He lived alone in a small apartment near campus, rarely attended departmental meetings or social functions, and seemed to exist on the periphery of academic life. His few interactions with colleagues were brief and awkward, marked by long silences and an apparent inability to engage in normal conversation. But something was changing in Ted's mind during these years. His anti-technology views were hardening into a comprehensive philosophy that viewed industrial civilization as fundamentally destructive to human nature and the natural world. He began to see his own work in mathematics, a field that contributed to technological advancement, as complicit in what he perceived as humanity's march toward destruction. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Colleagues noticed that Ted seemed increasingly agitated and distracted. His research output, while still impressive, began to decline. He spent more and more time alone, reading works of philosophy and social criticism that reinforced his growing conviction that modern society was fundamentally corrupt. Then, in June 1969, Ted Kaczynski shocked the academic world by abruptly resigning from his position at Berkeley. He gave no explanation to his colleagues, simply cleaned out his office and disappeared. The mathematics department was stunned. Here was a young professor with unlimited potential, someone who could have had tenure at any major university, walking away from everything he had worked toward. Ted's decision to leave Berkeley marked the end of his engagement with mainstream society. He returned to Illinois to live with his parents, but even this arrangement proved temporary. Ted had made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He was going to abandon civilization entirely and live as a hermit in the wilderness. In 1971, Ted Kaczynski purchased a small plot of land near Lincoln, Montana, using money he had saved from his teaching position. The property, located in a remote area of the Montana wilderness, came with a tiny cabin that had no electricity, no running water, and no telephone. For most people, such primitive conditions would have been unbearable. For Ted, they represented freedom. The cabin itself was almost absurdly small, just 10 feet by 12 feet, but Ted was not interested in comfort. He had come to Montana to live according to his own principles, to reject the technological society that he believed was destroying human dignity and the natural world. He would grow his own food, hunt and fish for protein, and live as simply as possible. At first, Ted's experiment in primitive living seemed to succeed. He learned to garden, to preserve food for winter, and to maintain his cabin with basic tools. He read voraciously, particularly works of history and social criticism that reinforced his anti-technology worldview. Authors like Jacques Ellul, Lewis Mumford, and others who had written critically about industrial society became his intellectual companions in the wilderness. But isolation and hardship began to take their toll on Ted's already fragile mental state. The Montana winters were brutal, with temperatures often dropping well below zero. Ted would sometimes go weeks without seeing another human being. He began to exhibit signs of paranoia, becoming convinced that the government was monitoring him and that various people were plotting against him. More troubling, Ted began to experience violent fantasies. He would later write in his journal about dreams of killing people who represented the technological society he despised. These fantasies initially served as an outlet for his rage, but they were becoming more frequent and more detailed. The line between fantasy and reality was beginning to blur. Ted's journal entries from this period reveal a man struggling with profound psychological distress. He wrote about feeling intense anger toward society, about his inability to form relationships with other people, and about his growing conviction that violence might be necessary to halt what he saw as the march of industrial civilization toward the destruction of human freedom. The transformation from hermit to terrorist didn't happen overnight. For several years in the mid-1970s, Ted Kaczynski struggled with his violent impulses while continuing to live his primitive lifestyle in Montana. He made occasional trips to the local library to read newspapers and magazines, staying informed about technological developments that confirmed his worst fears about the direction of society. Ted's first serious consideration of violence as a tool for social change appears to have emerged around 1975. In his journals, he began writing about the need for direct action against the technological system. He studied the tactics of various revolutionary groups, particularly focusing on the use of bombs as a means of drawing attention to political causes. The decision to build his first bomb was not made lightly. Ted spent months researching explosives, studying chemistry texts, and experimenting with different materials. His mathematical and scientific background gave him advantages that most would-be bombers lacked. He understood the principles of chemistry and physics that governed explosive reactions, and he could calculate the effects of different bomb designs with precision. Ted's first bombing attempt came in May 1978. He left a package bomb at the University of Illinois at Chicago, addressed to a professor in the engineering department. The bomb was designed to explode when opened, but a malfunction caused it to detonate prematurely. A security guard was injured, but not killed. The incident was treated as an isolated act of vandalism rather than the beginning of a campaign of terror. But Ted had crossed a psychological threshold. The bombing had given him a sense of power and purpose that he had never experienced before. For the first time in his adult life, he felt that he was taking meaningful action against the forces he believed were destroying the world. The fact that he had injured someone didn't trouble him. He had already convinced himself that violence was not only justified but necessary. Over the next 2 years, Ted Kaczynski refined his bombing techniques and expanded his target list. His bombs became more sophisticated and more deadly. He began to see himself not as a criminal but as a revolutionary, someone who was willing to take extreme action to save humanity from itself. Ted's second bombing occurred in May 1979, when he left a bomb in a package at Northwestern University. This time, the device worked as intended, seriously injuring a graduate student who opened it. The bombing was investigated by local police, but no connection was made to the earlier incident in Chicago. The bombs continued through 1980 and 1981, targeting universities and individuals associated with technology and industrial development. Ted was methodical in his approach, carefully researching his targets and taking elaborate precautions to avoid detection. He used fake names and addresses, paid cash for all materials, and never left fingerprints or other physical evidence. The bombings began to attract the attention of federal authorities when Ted placed a bomb on an American Airlines flight in November 1979. The device was designed to explode in mid-air, which would have killed everyone aboard. Fortunately, the bomb malfunctioned and caused only a minor fire, forcing the plane to make an emergency landing. The FBI realized they were dealing with someone who was willing to commit mass murder to advance his cause. By 1982, the FBI had established a task force to investigate what they were calling the Unabomber case, university and airline bomber. The investigation was one of the longest and most expensive in FBI history, ultimately involving more than 150 full-time agents and costing over $50 million. But Ted Kaczynski was proving to be an elusive target. His background in mathematics and his years of isolation had made him extremely cautious and methodical. He left no fingerprints, used materials that couldn't be traced, and communicated with his targets only through untraceable mail. The FBI had virtually no leads, and the bombings continued. Throughout the 1980s, Ted Kaczynski's bombing campaign became increasingly sophisticated and deadly. His bombs evolved from crude devices that often failed to sophisticated explosive packages that killed with precision. More importantly, his target selection became more focused and ideological. Ted was no longer randomly targeting people associated with universities or airlines. He was carefully selecting individuals who, in his view, represented the most dangerous aspects of technological society. Computer scientists, geneticists, aerospace engineers, and business executives who promoted technological development all found themselves on his target list. The bombing that truly announced Ted's presence to the world occurred in December 1985, when his package bomb killed Hugh Scruton, a computer store owner in Sacramento, California. Scruton's death marked a turning point in the Unabomber investigation. The FBI realized they were dealing not with a disturbed individual making random attacks, but with someone who had a coherent ideology and was systematically targeting people who represented that ideology. Ted's bombs were becoming works of deadly craftsmanship. He handmade virtually every component, carving wooden parts with tools he had made himself, mixing his own explosives, and designing triggering mechanisms that were both ingenious and reliable. Bomb disposal experts who examined his devices were impressed by their sophistication and attention to detail. But perhaps more troubling than the bombs themselves was the evidence of careful planning and research that went into each attack. Ted would spend months researching his targets, learning about their work, their schedules, and their personal lives. He was not impulsively lashing out, he was conducting a calculated campaign of terror against specific individuals. The psychological pressure on Ted's targets and their families was enormous. Computer scientists and engineers began to fear opening their mail. Universities implemented new security procedures for handling packages. The entire technology industry was on edge, unsure of who might be next. By the early 1990s, Ted Kaczynski had killed 3 people and injured many others, but he was frustrated by what he saw as the limited impact of his campaign. The bombings had certainly created fear and attracted media attention, but they hadn't sparked the kind of broader social movement he had hoped for. Ted began to realize that violence alone wasn't enough, he needed to articulate his philosophy and convince others to join his cause. This realization led to one of the most significant developments in the Unabomber case, Ted's decision to write and publish a comprehensive manifesto explaining his ideology and goals. The manifesto, which Ted titled Industrial Society and Its Future, was a 35,000-word essay that laid out his arguments against technology and industrial civilization in exhaustive detail. Ted began working on the manifesto in the early 1990s, spending hours each day writing and revising. The document that emerged was a sophisticated piece of social criticism that drew on his extensive reading in history, psychology, and political science. While his conclusions were extreme, his analysis of the problems of industrial society was often insightful and well-reasoned. The manifesto argued that the Industrial Revolution and its consequences had been a disaster for humanity. Ted contended that technological progress had created a society in which individuals had little real control over their lives, were subject to constant surveillance and manipulation, and were increasingly alienated from nature and from meaningful work. He predicted that continuing technological development would lead to the complete loss of human freedom and dignity. Ted's solution to these problems was radical, the complete dismantling of industrial civilization. He argued that this could only be achieved through a revolution that would destroy the technological infrastructure of modern society and return humanity to a more primitive way of life. Violence, he maintained, was not only justified but necessary to achieve this goal. Ted's strategy for publicizing his manifesto involved more than just writing it, he needed to find a way to force the media to publish it. His solution was both clever and chilling. He would threaten to continue his bombing campaign unless major newspapers agreed to print his essay in its entirety. In April 1995, Ted sent letters to several newspapers, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, along with a copy of his manifesto. The letters were typewritten on a manual typewriter and bore the signature, FC, which Ted later explained stood for Freedom Club, though he was apparently the organization's only member. The message was simple but effective: publish the manifesto or face continued bombings. To demonstrate that his threat was serious, Ted included details about previous bombings that had never been made public, proving that he was indeed the person the FBI had been seeking for nearly 2 decades. The letters also promised that if the manifesto were published, he would cease his bombing campaign, though he reserved the right to continue if his conditions weren't met exactly. The newspaper editors faced an unprecedented dilemma. Publishing the manifesto would essentially give a terrorist a platform to spread his ideology, potentially inspiring copycat attacks. On the other hand, refusing to publish might result in more innocent people being killed or injured. The FBI, which was consulted about the decision, eventually recommended publication, hoping that someone might recognize the writing style or ideology and provide a lead in the case. In September 1995, The Washington Post and the New York Times jointly published Ted's manifesto as a special supplement. The decision was controversial, with some critics arguing that it set a dangerous precedent for giving terrorists a voice. But the publication would ultimately lead to the break in the case that authorities had been seeking for nearly 18 years. David Kaczynski was working as a social worker in upstate New York when he saw news reports about the publication of the Unabomber manifesto. Like millions of other Americans, David was curious about the ideology that had driven someone to commit such terrible crimes. But as he began to read the manifesto, David experienced a growing sense of unease that would change his life forever. The writing style, the philosophical arguments, and even specific phrases in the manifesto reminded David of his brother Ted. Over the years, Ted had sent David long letters expounding many of the same ideas that appeared in the manifesto. The anti-technology themes, the criticism of industrial society, and the intellectual framework were all familiar to David from his brother's correspondence. David's recognition was not immediate or certain. The idea that his own brother could be the Unabomber seemed almost impossible to accept. David had known Ted was troubled and antisocial, but a terrorist and murderer. The possibility was too horrible to contemplate easily. David shared his suspicions with his wife, Linda, who encouraged him to take his concerns seriously. Together, they began comparing Ted's letters with the published manifesto, looking for specific similarities in language and ideas. The more they compared, the more convinced they became that Ted was likely the author of both documents. The decision to contact authorities was agonizing for David. Turning in his own brother meant potentially sending him to his death, as the Unabomber case was a federal capital crime. But David also recognized that if Ted continued his bombing campaign, more innocent people would die. After weeks of anguished deliberation, David made the decision that would end one of the longest-running manhunts in American history. When David Kaczynski contacted the FBI in February 1996, agents were initially skeptical. They had received thousands of tips over the years, most of which had led nowhere. But as David provided more details about his brother's background, ideology, and behavior, investigators began to take his information seriously. The FBI was particularly interested in David's description of Ted's living situation in Montana. The idea that the Unabomber might be a hermit living in a remote cabin fit with their psychological profile of the suspect. They had long believed that the bomber was highly intelligent, well-educated, and likely lived alone with minimal contact with other people. David provided the FBI with copies of letters Ted had sent him over the years, and linguistic experts began comparing them with the manifesto and other communications from the bomber. The similarities were striking, not just in the ideas expressed but in specific word choices, sentence structures, and even spelling errors. The evidence was building that Ted Kaczynski was indeed the person they had been seeking. But the FBI needed more than circumstantial evidence to arrest Ted. They needed to find physical proof that he had built and sent the bombs. This meant they would have to search his cabin, a delicate operation that required careful planning. If Ted was indeed the Unabomber and he realized he was under suspicion, he might flee or destroy evidence. Worse, he might continue his bombing campaign with increased frequency and lethality. The FBI decided to approach the situation cautiously. They placed Ted's cabin under surveillance while preparing for a search. Agents posed as local residents and kept watch on Ted's activities, looking for any indication that he was building bombs or preparing to flee. Meanwhile, they assembled a team of experts to conduct the search when the time came. On April 3, 1996, FBI agents surrounded Ted Kaczynski's remote cabin near Lincoln, Montana. Ted was outside tending to his garden when agents approached and identified themselves. 19 years after his first bombing attempt, the most wanted domestic terrorist in American history was finally in custody. Ted's arrest was conducted without violence, though agents noted his strange appearance and behavior. He had been living as a hermit for over 2 decades, and it showed. His hair and beard were long and unkempt, his clothes were ragged and dirty, and he seemed bewildered by the sudden appearance of dozens of federal agents at his remote home. When agents asked Ted to identify himself, he initially gave a false name. But when they told him he was under arrest in connection with the Unabomber case, Ted became silent and remained so for the rest of the day. His silence, agents would later note, was itself incriminating. An innocent person would have protested their innocence or demanded to know what evidence existed against them. Ted simply shut down. The search of Ted's cabin yielded a treasure trove of evidence. Agents found bomb-making materials, partially completed explosive devices, and detailed notebooks describing bombing techniques. They discovered typewritten copies of letters sent to newspapers and victims, as well as handwritten drafts of the manifesto. Most damning of all, they found a detailed list of future targets, indicating that Ted had been planning to continue his campaign indefinitely. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Agents found the manual typewriter used to write the letters claiming responsibility for the bombings. They discovered tools and materials that matched components found in the bombs. They found journal entries in which Ted described his bombings and expressed satisfaction at having killed and injured his victims. Perhaps most revealing were the thousands of pages of journals and writings that Ted had accumulated over the years. These documents provided an extraordinary window into the mind of a terrorist, showing his gradual transformation from an isolated academic to a calculating killer. The writings revealed not only Ted's ideology but also his psychological state, his paranoid fantasies, and his complete lack of empathy for his victims. Ted Kaczynski's trial was one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings of the 1990s. The case raised fundamental questions about the nature of terrorism, the role of mental illness in criminal behavior, and the limits of political protest in a democratic society. From the beginning, Ted's legal team faced a difficult challenge. The evidence against their client was overwhelming, and Ted had essentially confessed through his detailed journals and writings. Their only realistic strategy was to argue that Ted was mentally ill and therefore not fully responsible for his actions. Ted himself strongly opposed this strategy. He insisted that he was sane and that his actions were the result of rational political beliefs, not mental illness. Ted feared that a successful insanity defense would undermine the political message he had tried to convey through his bombings and manifesto. He wanted to be seen as a revolutionary, not a madman. The conflict between Ted and his attorneys created unprecedented courtroom drama. Ted fired his lawyers multiple times and attempted to represent himself, despite having no legal training. He tried to enter a guilty plea to avoid a trial that would focus on his mental state, but the judge refused to accept the plea without assurances that Ted was competent to make such a decision. The prosecution, led by federal attorneys, presented a methodical case demonstrating Ted's guilt. They showed how he had carefully planned each bombing, selected his targets based on his anti-technology ideology, and taken elaborate precautions to avoid detection. They argued that Ted's actions were those of a calculating terrorist, not a mentally ill person acting irrationally. The defense team brought in psychiatrists who diagnosed Ted with paranoid schizophrenia and argued that his bombing campaign was the result of delusions rather than rational political beliefs. They contended that Ted's isolation, his paranoid fantasies, and his inability to form normal relationships were all symptoms of severe mental illness. As the trial proceeded, it became clear that Ted would almost certainly be convicted and face the death penalty. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his own writings provided a detailed confession to his crimes. Faced with this reality, Ted's family and attorneys began to explore the possibility of a plea agreement that would spare his life. Negotiations were complicated by Ted's opposition to any deal that would portray him as mentally ill. He preferred to face execution rather than accept a plea that would undermine his political message. But ultimately, practical considerations prevailed. Ted's family convinced him that his death would serve no useful purpose and might actually detract from the manifesto and ideology he wanted to promote. In January 1998, Ted Kaczynski entered a plea agreement with federal prosecutors. He agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The agreement allowed Ted to avoid a trial that would have focused extensively on his mental state, while ensuring that he would never again be free to harm anyone. The plea hearing was brief and businesslike. Ted admitted his guilt to all charges, acknowledged that he had killed 3 people and injured many others, and accepted his sentence without visible emotion. When asked by the judge if he understood that he would spend the rest of his life in prison, Ted simply replied, "Yes." Ted's victims and their families had mixed reactions to the plea agreement. Some were relieved that Ted would never be free again and that they would be spared the ordeal of a lengthy trial. Others felt that Ted deserved the death penalty for his crimes and were disappointed that he would escape execution. All agreed that justice had been served, even if it wasn't perfect justice. Ted Kaczynski was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and was transferred to ADX Florence, the federal government's most secure prison facility. Located in Colorado, ADX Florence houses the most dangerous terrorists and criminals in the federal system, including other notorious figures like Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh, until his execution, and 9/11 conspirator Zacarias Moussaoui. At ADX Florence, Ted lives in almost complete isolation. He spends 23 hours a day in a small concrete cell with minimal human contact. He is allowed 1 hour of exercise per day in a small outdoor cage, and his meals are delivered through a slot in his door. For someone who had chosen isolation in Montana, this enforced solitude represents a different kind of confinement entirely. Despite his circumstances, Ted has continued to write and study. He has been allowed access to books and has reportedly been working on various writing projects, though prison officials strictly control his communications with the outside world. He has given few interviews and has generally maintained the same withdrawn, antisocial personality that characterized his earlier life. Ted's health has reportedly declined during his years in prison. He is now in his 80s and suffers from various age-related ailments. Former FBI agents and others who have had contact with him report that he shows little remorse for his crimes and continues to believe that his actions were justified. The question of Ted's mental state remains contentious. Prison psychiatrists have diagnosed him with various conditions, including paranoid schizophrenia, but Ted continues to insist that he is sane and that his actions were politically motivated. This debate about his mental health reflects broader questions about the relationship between extreme political beliefs and mental illness. The Unabomber case had profound implications for American society and law enforcement. It demonstrated the vulnerability of an open society to terrorist attacks by lone individuals and highlighted the challenges faced by authorities in investigating cases where the perpetrator operates in complete isolation. The investigation itself became a landmark in the use of forensic science and behavioral profiling. FBI analysts developed new techniques for analyzing physical evidence, handwriting, and linguistic patterns that have been used in numerous subsequent cases. The psychological profile of the bomber, developed over years of investigation, proved to be remarkably accurate and has influenced how authorities approach similar cases. Ted's manifesto, despite its association with terrorism, has been studied by scholars interested in critiques of technology and industrial society. While few endorse his violent methods, some acknowledge that his analysis of the problems created by technological progress contains insights worth considering. The manifesto has been translated into multiple languages and continues to circulate on the Internet, where it has found audiences among various anti-technology and environmental movements. The case also raised important questions about media responsibility in covering terrorism. The decision to publish Ted's manifesto was controversial and established a precedent that continues to influence how news organizations handle similar situations. Critics argue that publication gave terrorists a platform and might encourage copycat attacks, while supporters contend that it served the public interest and ultimately led to Ted's capture. The Unabomber case occurred at a time when American society was becoming increasingly dependent on technology, and Ted's warnings about the dangers of technological progress have seemed prophetic to some observers. Issues like surveillance, privacy, artificial intelligence, and environmental destruction that Ted wrote about in his manifesto have become major public policy concerns in the decades since his arrest. Ted Kaczynski's life and crimes raise fundamental questions about the nature of violence, political protest, and social change in a democratic society. His case illustrates the danger posed by individuals who become so convinced of the righteousness of their cause that they are willing to kill innocent people to advance it. The question of whether Ted was mentally ill or simply possessed extreme political beliefs remains unresolved. Mental health experts continue to debate whether his actions were the result of paranoid delusions or rational, if misguided, political calculations. This debate reflects broader societal questions about the relationship between mental illness and criminal responsibility. Ted's critique of technology and industrial society, while expressed through horrific violence, touches on legitimate concerns about the direction of modern civilization. Issues like environmental destruction, loss of privacy, economic inequality, and social alienation that he wrote about have become major political issues in recent decades. His case demonstrates how legitimate social concerns can be perverted into justifications for violence by individuals who lose touch with moral constraints. The Unabomber case also illustrates the importance of family relationships in identifying and stopping dangerous individuals. David Kaczynski's decision to turn in his brother was agonizing but ultimately prevented further violence. His choice highlights the difficult position faced by family members who suspect that someone they love may be capable of terrible crimes. As this narrative draws to a close, it's worth reflecting on the extraordinary trajectory of Ted Kaczynski's life. He began as one of the most promising mathematical minds of his generation, someone who might have made groundbreaking contributions to human knowledge. Instead, he became one of America's most notorious domestic terrorists, remembered not for his intellectual achievements but for the innocent lives he destroyed. Ted's transformation from promising academic to calculating killer was gradual but inexorable. His intellectual gifts, combined with his social isolation and psychological problems, created a dangerous combination that ultimately exploded into violence. His case serves as a warning about the potential dangers posed by brilliant but alienated individuals who lose touch with basic human empathy. The victims of Ted's bombing campaign, Hugh Scruton, Thomas Mosser, Gilbert Murray, and the many others who were injured, deserves to be remembered not as statistics in a criminal case but as real people whose lives were cut short or permanently altered by one man's twisted ideology. They were fathers, husbands, colleagues, and friends whose loss was deeply felt by those who loved them. Today, nearly 3 decades after his arrest, Ted Kaczynski remains in prison at ADX Florence, where he will likely spend the remainder of his life. He is now in his 80s, an elderly man whose once brilliant mind has been consumed by the same paranoid obsessions that drove him to violence decades ago. He has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked brilliance combined with social isolation and mental illness. The Unabomber case reminds us that terrorism can emerge from unexpected sources and that the greatest threats to a free society sometimes come from those who claim to be its defenders. Ted Kaczynski believed he was fighting to preserve human freedom and dignity, but his methods destroyed both in himself and in his victims. His life stands as a tragic example of how noble ideals can be corrupted into justifications for the most ignoble acts. In the end, Ted Kaczynski's story is not just about one man's descent into violence, but about the broader challenges facing modern society. His case highlights the potential dangers of technological progress without adequate consideration of its human costs, the importance of maintaining social connections in an increasingly isolated world, and the need for constructive channels for addressing legitimate concerns about the direction of civilization. The Unabomber investigation represented a watershed moment in the development of modern forensic science and criminal profiling. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, working with investigators from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, developed revolutionary techniques that would influence law enforcement practices for decades to come. One of the most significant innovations was the comprehensive analysis of the bomber's signature techniques. Each of Ted's devices contained unique characteristics that investigators learned to recognize: the hand-carved wooden components, the specific types of screws and batteries used, and the distinctive way components were assembled. These signatures became so recognizable that experts could identify a Unabomber device within minutes of examination. The linguistic analysis of Ted's communications also broke new ground in forensic science. FBI analysts worked with linguists and computer specialists to identify patterns in word choice, sentence structure, and even punctuation that could serve as a fingerprint of the author's writing style. This technique, known as forensic linguistics or stylometry, has since become a standard tool in criminal investigations involving written communications. The development of the bomber's psychological profile was equally groundbreaking. FBI profilers, led by agents like John Douglas, created an increasingly detailed picture of the suspect's likely background, personality, and living situation. The profile suggested that the bomber was a highly intelligent, well-educated white male in his 40s or 50s, probably with a background in mathematics or engineering, who lived alone and had minimal contact with other people. This profile, developed years before Ted's identity was known, proved to be remarkably accurate. Perhaps most importantly, the investigation demonstrated the power of coordinated interagency cooperation. The Unabomber Task Force brought together agents from the FBI, ATF, U.S. Postal Inspection Service, and numerous local law enforcement agencies. This collaboration, while sometimes difficult to manage, allowed investigators to share information and expertise in ways that had never been attempted before. Understanding Ted Kaczynski requires examining not just his actions but the psychological factors that may have contributed to his transformation from academic to terrorist. While the question of his mental health remains contentious, several patterns in his behavior and thinking are worth examining. Ted's journals, discovered during the search of his cabin, provide an extraordinary window into the mind of a developing terrorist. These writings, spanning decades, show his gradual descent into paranoid thinking and his increasing conviction that violence was not only justified but necessary. The journals reveal a man who was profoundly lonely yet contemptuous of other people, brilliant yet unable to form meaningful relationships, and convinced of his own moral superiority while planning acts of terrible violence. One particularly troubling aspect of Ted's psychology was his complete lack of empathy for his victims. His journals contain detailed descriptions of the bombings, but they focus entirely on the technical aspects of the devices and their effectiveness. There is virtually no acknowledgement that real people were hurt or killed, no expression of regret or remorse. This emotional disconnection is characteristic of individuals with severe antisocial personality disorders. Ted's relationship with his family, particularly his younger brother David, provides additional insights into his psychological development. Despite their shared childhood and family background, the two brothers developed very different personalities. David became a caring, socially engaged person who worked as a social worker helping troubled youth. Ted became increasingly isolated and misanthropic. This difference suggests that Ted's problems were not simply the result of his upbringing or environment, but reflected deeper psychological issues. The role of Ted's exceptional intelligence in his psychological development is also worth considering. His high IQ may have contributed to his sense of superiority and his contempt for ordinary people. He appears to have believed that his intellectual gifts gave him special insights into the nature of society and technology that others couldn't understand. This intellectual arrogance may have made it easier for him to justify violence against people he considered intellectually inferior. Ted Kaczynski's manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, remains one of the most widely read terrorist documents in history. Despite its association with violence, the manifesto has continued to attract readers and has influenced various political and social movements around the world. The manifesto's central argument, that industrial technology has created a society that is fundamentally hostile to human nature and freedom, resonates with people across the political spectrum who are concerned about the direction of modern civilization. Environmental activists have found value in Ted's critique of industrial society's impact on the natural world. Privacy advocates have pointed to his warnings about surveillance and social control. Critics of globalization have cited his arguments about the loss of local autonomy and community. This continued influence is troubling to many observers, who worry that Ted's ideas might inspire future acts of violence. Several individuals who have committed terrorist attacks in recent decades have cited the manifesto as an influence on their thinking. This raises difficult questions about the responsibility of ideas for the actions they inspire and the appropriate way to discuss dangerous ideologies without promoting them. At the same time, some scholars argue that the manifesto's popularity reflects legitimate concerns about the problems created by rapid technological change. They contend that dismissing Ted's ideas entirely because of his violent methods prevents society from grappling with real issues that need to be addressed. This perspective suggests that the manifesto should be studied as a historical document that illuminates certain aspects of the modern human condition, even while completely rejecting the violent conclusions Ted drew from his analysis. The manifesto has also been influential in academic circles, where it has been analyzed by scholars in fields ranging from political science to psychology to technology studies. These academic treatments typically focus on understanding Ted's ideas and their origins rather than endorsing his conclusions, but they have helped to establish the manifesto as a significant document in the literature of social criticism. While much attention has been focused on Ted Kaczynski himself, it's crucial to remember the real human cost of his actions. His bombing campaign claimed 3 lives and injured nearly 24 other people, each of whom had families, friends, and communities that were devastated by these attacks. Hugh Scruton, killed in December 1985, was a 38-year-old computer store owner in Sacramento, California. He was married and had a young daughter. Hugh was known as a kind and generous person who enjoyed helping customers understand new technology. His death was particularly tragic because it occurred when he was simply doing his job, trying to clean up his parking lot at the end of the day. Thomas Mosser, killed in December 1994, was a 50-year-old advertising executive who was opening mail at his home in North Caldwell, New Jersey, when Ted's bomb exploded. Thomas was a devoted family man with a wife and 4 daughters. He had been looking forward to celebrating Christmas with his family when his life was cut short by a package he thought contained business materials. Gilbert Murray, killed in April 1995, was the 47-year-old president of the California Forestry Association. He was targeted by Ted because of his association with the timber industry, which Ted viewed as destructive to the natural environment. Gilbert was known as a dedicated conservationist who worked to promote sustainable forestry practices. Ironically, he shared some of Ted's concerns about environmental protection, but his moderate approach to balancing economic and environmental interests made him a target. The survivors of Ted's attacks also deserve recognition for the courage they showed in rebuilding their lives after being injured. Many suffered permanent disabilities, required multiple surgeries, and endured years of physical therapy. Some lost fingers, hands, or suffered severe burns and scarring. All had to cope with the psychological trauma of being randomly targeted by a terrorist. The families of both the victims and survivors also paid a heavy price. They lived with grief, anger, and fear long after the physical wounds had healed. Many struggled with questions about why their loved ones had been targeted and whether they could have done anything to prevent the attacks. The randomness of Ted's target selection made the attacks particularly traumatic, as it seemed that anyone could become a victim. The Unabomber case transformed American law enforcement's approach to investigating domestic terrorism and other complex criminal cases. The lessons learned from the nearly two-decade investigation have influenced everything from forensic analysis techniques to interagency cooperation protocols. One of the most important innovations was the development of comprehensive evidence databases that allowed investigators to cross-reference information from multiple sources. The Unabomber task force created detailed files on every aspect of the case, from the technical specifications of the bombs to the personal histories of potential suspects. This systematic approach to information management became a model for other major investigations. The case also demonstrated the importance of behavioral profiling in criminal investigations. The psychological profile of the Unabomber, developed by FBI experts, proved to be remarkably accurate and helped guide the investigation in productive directions. This success led to increased use of profiling techniques in other cases and to greater investment in the behavioral sciences within law enforcement agencies. The linguistic analysis conducted in the case also established new standards for the use of writing analysis in criminal investigations. The techniques developed to analyze Ted's manifesto and other communications have been refined and applied to numerous subsequent cases involving anonymous communications, from terrorist threats to extortion demands. Perhaps most importantly, the case highlighted the crucial role that family members and close associates can play in identifying dangerous individuals. David Kaczynski's decision to contact authorities after recognizing his brother's writing in the manifesto prevented what could have been many more attacks. This has led law enforcement agencies to place greater emphasis on public awareness campaigns and on maintaining channels for people to report concerns about potentially dangerous individuals. The investigation also revealed important limitations in law enforcement capabilities. Despite enormous resources and the dedication of hundreds of investigators, authorities were unable to identify Ted until his brother came forward. This highlighted the challenges posed by lone wolf terrorists who operate without accomplices or connections to larger organizations. These lessons have informed subsequent efforts to detect and prevent domestic terrorism. In the decades since Ted Kaczynski's arrest, many of the technological developments he warned against in his manifesto have become reality. The rise of the Internet, social media, artificial intelligence, and ubiquitous surveillance has created a world that bears some resemblance to the dystopian future Ted predicted. This has led some observers to reconsider his ideas, even while rejecting his violent methods. Ted wrote about the dangers of a society in which people would be constantly monitored and controlled by technological systems. The development of sophisticated surveillance capabilities by both governments and private corporations has made such monitoring possible on a scale Ted could hardly have imagined. Smartphones, social media platforms, and internet search engines now collect detailed information about people's activities, relationships, and interests. The manifesto also warned about the psychological effects of living in a society dominated by technology. Ted argued that people would become increasingly dependent on technological systems for their basic needs and would lose the ability to live independently. The rise of social media addiction, the decline of practical skills, and the increasing reliance on digital devices for everything from navigation to social interaction seem to validate some of these concerns. Ted's warnings about artificial intelligence and automation have also proven prescient. He predicted that advanced technology would eventually make human labor unnecessary, leading to mass unemployment and social unrest. The development of AI systems that can perform tasks once thought to require human intelligence has made these concerns more immediate and real. However, it's important to note that technological development has also brought significant benefits that TED's manifesto largely ignored. Medical advances have saved countless lives, communication technology has connected people across the globe, and digital tools have democratized access to information and education. The challenge for modern society is to harness the benefits of technology while mitigating its potential dangers, something that requires thoughtful analysis and democratic deliberation, not the violent destruction TED advocated. The fact that some of TED's predictions have proven accurate doesn't validate his methods or conclusions. Violence is never an appropriate response to technological concerns, and the complex challenges of modern society require nuanced solutions, not the simplistic return to primitive living that TED proposed. His case serves as a reminder that legitimate concerns about technology and social change must be addressed through constructive political processes, not through terrorism. The story of Ted Kaczynski serves as a powerful cautionary tale for our times. It demonstrates how intellectual brilliance combined with social isolation and psychological instability can produce devastating results. It shows how legitimate concerns about social and technological change can be perverted into justifications for violence. And it illustrates the importance of maintaining human connections and empathy in an increasingly complex and technological world. Ted's life trajectory from promising mathematician to domestic terrorist was not inevitable. At multiple points, different choices or interventions might have led to different outcomes. If he had received appropriate treatment for his psychological problems, if he had maintained connections with family and colleagues, if he had found constructive ways to express his concerns about technology and society, the tragedy that unfolded might have been prevented. The case also highlights the resilience of democratic institutions and the dedication of law enforcement professionals. Despite the challenges posed by investigating a lone wolf terrorist who left few clues and operated in complete isolation, authorities never gave up their pursuit. The investigation required enormous resources and took nearly 2 decades to complete, but it ultimately succeeded in bringing a dangerous criminal to justice. Perhaps most importantly, Ted Kaczynski's story reminds us of the human capacity for both great good and great evil. The same intellectual gifts that might have contributed to human knowledge and understanding were instead used to cause suffering and death. This serves as a reminder that intelligence and education are not sufficient to ensure moral behavior, they must be combined with empathy, social connection, and a commitment to constructive rather than destructive action. As we face our own challenges with technological change, environmental degradation, and social transformation, Ted Kaczynski's story provides important lessons. It reminds us that we must find ways to address legitimate concerns about the direction of society through democratic processes and peaceful means. It shows us the importance of maintaining human connections and preventing the isolation that can lead to dangerous radicalization. And it demonstrates that the price of failing to address social problems constructively can be measured in human lives. The mathematics professor who became a terrorist will be remembered not for his intellectual achievements but for the innocent lives he destroyed. His story stands as a permanent reminder that brilliance without wisdom, knowledge without compassion, and conviction without empathy can lead to the darkest destinations of the human experience. In our continuing efforts to build a better world, we must ensure that we learn from his mistakes while honoring the memory of those who paid the ultimate price for his twisted vision of social change.